Welcome to this gripping tale of resilience, ambition, and unexpected revelations. Before we dive in, feel free to share in the comments where you're reading from. Now, let's embark on a journey where hidden identities, deep loyalties, and unexpected alliances take shape, 30,000 feet above the ground. Leila Carter had always carried a quiet determination in her heart. As she stepped into the lively cabin, she was met with the familiar hum of overhead lights, the faint metallic scent of pressurized air, and the quick, polite smiles of travelers who barely spared her a second glance before returning to their own business. Most never took the time to see beyond her crisp navy uniform. But beneath that meticulously pressed attire, Leila carried a lifetime of perseverance. She hadn't simply arrived in this role, she had fought for it. She had started at the airline as an intern, at first not even allowed to serve drinks, instead spending her days restocking flight carts and running up and down the jet bridge for last-minute supplies. Yet she absorbed everything, learning the rhythms of the airline, forming bonds with mentors, and slowly working her way up. Leila wasn't just a flight attendant. She spoke multiple languages fluently, held a master's degree in business she had earned while juggling double shifts, and quietly supported philanthropic efforts in her spare time. None of this was reflected on her name tag. None of it was mentioned in the flight announcements she made. Perhaps that was why she found a strange sense of power in being underestimated. She had long grown accustomed to the assumptions people made about her, but no matter how much she had learned to brush it off, there was always a faint sting when she noticed passengers dismissing her, especially those who saw only her skin and let their biases dictate their behavior. Her day had begun, as always, with an early morning cappuccino in the crew lounge, the warmth of the cup a small comfort against the sharp chill of the air conditioning. Despite the exhaustion of back-to-back flights, she greeted her colleagues with bright eyes and an easy smile. To Leila, this wasn't just a job. It was a space where people from all walks of life intersected. A place where a stranger's day could be changed with something as simple as a warm smile, an extra blanket, or the patience to answer a nervous traveler's question. She viewed every flight as a tapestry of countless backgrounds and experiences, and she had the choice to be either the quiet thread holding it all together or the vibrant color that stood out. Most days, she opted for subtlety. On this particular flight from Boston to San Francisco, Leila was preparing for a routine journey. She moved through the pre-flight checks effortlessly, securing overhead bins, running safety demonstrations, ensuring everything was in place. The departure lounge was a mix of business travelers, families, and the occasional vacationer. As she welcomed passengers aboard, she recognized a few frequent flyers, familiar faces, though their names sometimes escaped her. And then, she noticed him. A man with an unmistakable air of authority strode onto the plane, phone pressed to his ear, brows furrowed in irritation. His voice carried an edge of impatience as he snapped orders into the receiver. Even as the gate agent maintained a composed, professional smile, he waved a dismissive hand at her, treating her presence as an inconvenience rather than a person assisting him. Leila took note of this instantly. She had dealt with passengers like him before, the ones who walked as if the world revolved around them, who treated any minor inconvenience as an affront to their status. As he reached the entrance, Leila greeted him with the same polite professionalism she extended to every passenger. He barely acknowledged her, his gaze flickering over her as if evaluating whether she was worth his attention. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh of disdain, he brushed past her without a word. Behind him trailed his assistant, a woman with a tense expression, juggling a sleek leather bag and a laptop case. Leila had a feeling she wasn't just carrying his belongings. She was carrying the weight of his expectations, his demands, and likely his temper. Leila inhaled deeply, centering herself. Her job was to maintain a smooth and pleasant flight experience, regardless of the personalities on board. And something told her that this man, whoever he was about to make that job significantly harder. As Leila continued welcoming the last of the passengers, the cabin gradually filled with the familiar sounds of rustling seatbelts, quiet conversations, and the occasional beeping of overhead compartments being latched shut. The aircraft was nearly ready for takeoff. She was in the middle of her final safety checks when her colleague, Mira Thompson, a tall, outgoing flight attendant with a cascade of tight curls, waved her over. Mira leaned in with a whisper, her eyes flicking toward seat 2A. "That guy already snapped at me because I gave him the wrong brand of bottled water," Mira muttered, rolling her eyes slightly. Leila gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't take it personally. I'll handle him from here." Leila wasn't new to dealing with difficult passengers. As a black woman, she had faced far worse than complaints about bottled water. What stung the most wasn't necessarily the rudeness. It was the restraint she had to exercise, the professionalism she had to uphold, even when every fiber of her being longed to speak her truth. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Leila and Mira began the first-class beverage service. The man in 2A, she soon learned, was none other than Richard Langford, a high-profile CEO whose name occasionally appeared in the business sections of the news articles Leila liked to read. She recalled something about him: talk of a major tech acquisition in Europe, whispers of tension within his company's boardroom. There were even rumors about an impending leadership shakeup due to allegations of a toxic workplace culture. At the moment, however, Richard Langford was just another irritable passenger, his phone pressed to his ear as he muttered sharply into it, completely engrossed in a heated negotiation. Leila approached him with her usual polished grace, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb his conversation but clear enough that he could hear her. "Good afternoon, sir. May I offer you a drink or snack to start?" Langford barely glanced at her before lifting a hand, a single finger raised in a dismissive gesture, effectively silencing her. Leila bit the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. She nodded politely and stepped back, giving him space. Moments later, he snapped his phone shut with an irritated sigh and turned toward her. "Do you mind? I'm on an important call." Leila met his eyes with steady professionalism. "Of course, sir. I'll check back in a few minutes." She turned her attention to the woman in 2B, his assistant. The woman, who introduced herself as Olivia Wells, offered Leila an apologetic smile, the kind that suggested she had spent too many hours managing her boss's temper. "I'll just have water, please." "Any brand is fine," Olivia said softly, as if hoping not to attract any unnecessary attention to herself. Leila gave her a kind nod. "Of course, I'll be right back with that." As she moved toward the galley to prepare the drinks, Langford's rudeness lingered in her mind for only a moment before she pushed it aside. This was her job, and she took pride in doing it well, no matter how others saw her. In the galley, Mira raised an eyebrow as Leila handed her a glass. "That guy is wound tight," Mira whispered. Leila sighed. "He's definitely high-strung, but we've handled worse, haven't we?" Mira let out a soft laugh. "True, but he's not going to be the highlight of my day, that's for sure." The two shared a knowing glance before heading back to the aisles. When Leila handed Olivia her glass of water, she took a moment to glance at Langford. He was glaring down at his phone, his jaw tight, tension radiating off of him. Leila briefly wondered if the rumors she had read were true, if the board was, in fact, preparing to push him out. Maybe that explained his mood. She shook off the thought. It wasn't her job to analyze her passengers' business affairs. Her job was to keep the flight running smoothly. That smoothness, however, was quickly interrupted. From beyond the curtain separating first class from the economy cabin, the unmistakable sounds of a raised argument began to filter through. Leila and Mira exchanged glances. Mira was in the middle of offering another passenger a warm towel. Leila gave her a quick nod, silently offering to handle it. As she stepped into the main cabin, she found two passengers in the middle of a heated dispute. One, a middle-aged woman, her arms crossed tightly, and the other, a man with a sharp scowl, gesturing aggressively toward the overhead bins. Though Leila wasn't sure what the argument was about at first, she could guess. Keeping her voice steady and warm, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, how can I help resolve this?" Both passengers turned toward her, speaking over each other. "He put his bag in my overhead space, and now there's no room for my carry-on," the woman exclaimed. "The bins are first come, first served," the man retorted. "I was here first, so I took the space. Not my fault she didn't get here sooner." Leila kept her expression composed. "Let's find a solution that works for everyone," she said in a calm, diplomatic tone. Sir, we do have alternative storage options. If you'd allow me, I'd be happy to place your bag in a nearby compartment, and that way, both of you have the space you need. The man grumbled under his breath, but after a moment of hesitation, he relented. Leila swiftly found an open spot for his bag, ensuring that both passengers were accommodated. The tension eased, at least somewhat. As she stepped back through the curtain, she was met with an unexpected sight: Richard Langford watching her, his sharp gaze tracking her movements. For a brief moment, Leila wondered if she was imagining it. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he gestured for her to come over. Something in her told her that whatever was coming next wouldn't be pleasant. Leila had barely returned to first class when she noticed it. Richard Langford watching her, his expression unreadable, his sharp gaze locked onto her as if evaluating everything she had just done. For a brief second, she hesitated. Was she imagining it? Then, with a quick flick of his hand, he beckoned her over. Leila straightened her posture and approached, keeping her professionalism intact. He didn't say a word, didn't even glance up fully, just tapped his empty glass on the tray table, an unspoken demand for a refill. Swallowing her frustration, Leila picked up the glass. "Would you like the same drink, sir?" she asked evenly. Langford barely acknowledged her. "Yes." Quickly. She turned and walked back to the galley, forcing herself to exhale slowly. The flight would only last a few more hours. She could endure it. As time passed, it became increasingly clear that Langford was fixated on something far beyond the flight. He took multiple calls, his voice a low but insistent murmur. Whenever a flight attendant gently reminded him about electronic device policies, he waved them off as though they were beneath his concern. More than once, Leila caught flickers of irritation in his expression, moments where his eyes hardened when they landed on her, like she was some kind of unwelcome reminder of a problem he couldn't solve. She ignored it, but then, during meal service, the situation escalated. Langford was reviewing the menu when his lips curled into a sneer. "I need the grilled salmon with saffron risotto," he said. Leila glanced at the manifest, then back at him. "I'm sorry, sir, but that dish is not available on today's flight. We do offer a selection of special meals, but they must be pre-ordered before departure." Langford's eyes darkened. "So what you're telling me is, you can't accommodate a simple request?" His voice was edged with disdain. Leila remained steady. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir. If you'd like, I can take note of your preference for future flights." Langford let out a sharp exhale, rolling his eyes. "I shouldn't have to jump through hoops for a decent meal, but I suppose you wouldn't understand the concept of fine dining, would you?" The sting of his words settled deep, but Leila refused to let it show. Her voice remained even. "I understand that you have specific tastes, sir. I'll be sure to pass along your feedback to the catering department." Langford scoffed. "Don't bother. They won't do anything anyway." And just like that, he turned back to his phone, dismissing her entirely. Leila took the tray and returned to the galley, her shoulders tight. She didn't realize she had been holding her breath until she finally let it out in a slow, measured exhale. Mira was waiting for her, concern in her eyes. "Do you want me to handle him?" she asked gently. Leila shook her head. "I've got it under control, but thanks for asking." As the flight wore on, Leila became increasingly aware that the other first-class passengers had noticed Langford's behavior. Some offered her small, supportive smiles. Others kept their heads down, avoiding the tension altogether. Then there was Olivia, Langford's assistant. She had barely spoken since the flight began, keeping her head low, making herself small. Leila could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her fingers tensed slightly every time Langford's voice took on a sharper edge. Leila knew that look too well, the silent endurance of someone who had learned to shrink themselves to survive. Eventually, the cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled in for the rest of the flight. But Langford remained restless, typing furiously on his laptop, taking more hushed phone calls. Leila observed from the galley as she prepared drinks. A quiet curiosity stirred inside her. She had read the rumors, the whispers about a corporate scandal that might unseat Langford from his own company. And now she was seeing it unfold in real time. At one point, she caught a fragment of his conversation. "I don't care what the board says," he muttered, his voice taut with fury. "I built this company. They're not forcing me out without a fight." A pause. No, we don't need a new CFO. I'll handle this on my own. Another pause. Then, Leila heard something that made her stomach tighten. What do you mean? They want an internal investigation? That's ridiculous. Over what? Silence. Then his voice dropped into a sneer. I'm not worried about any flight attendant's testimony, that's just speculation. She wouldn't dare cross me. People like her know their place. Trust me. Leila's grip on the drink cart tightened. She realized with a cold certainty that he wasn't just talking about any flight attendant, he was talking about her. Leila gritted her teeth as she processed Richard Langford's words. She wouldn't dare cross me. People like her know their place. Whether he was talking about her specifically or flight attendants in general, it didn't matter. The sheer arrogance in his voice made her blood simmer. But she had learned long ago that responding in anger never helped. Instead, she took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, reminding herself that this shift had an expiration time. Soon the flight would land, and Langford would be nothing more than an unpleasant memory. Determined to shake off the moment, Leila busied herself clearing meal trays. She found a brief moment of peace when she chatted with a father and his young daughter in business class. They were en route to California for a soccer tournament, and the little girl, eager to practice her Spanish, tried a few phrases with Leila. Leila responded fluently, her warm encouragement making the child beam with excitement. Moments like these were why she loved her job. She might only cross paths with passengers for a few fleeting hours, but in that time, she could offer kindness, patience, and a bit of light in an otherwise impersonal world. Perhaps that was why it hurt more than she liked to admit when someone treated her as if she was invisible, or worse, disposable. Returning to first class, Leila glanced at Olivia, Langford's assistant. She had been quiet the entire flight, hunched slightly in her seat, as if trying to make herself smaller. Leila approached her gently. Is everything okay? Do you need anything? A refill on water? Olivia looked up, startled, before offering a small, hesitant smile. I'm fine, thank you. I appreciate the kindness. It's no trouble at all, Leila reassured her. For a moment, Olivia hesitated. Leila could tell she wanted to say something more, but fear held her back. Her gaze flickered toward Langford's seat, checking to see if he was watching. Then, in a hushed whisper, she admitted, He's under a lot of stress. He's not usually like this. She paused as if realizing that wasn't entirely true. Or maybe he is, just worse today. Leila nodded sympathetically. I understand. If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know. Olivia swallowed hard. Her eyes glistened with something Leila couldn't quite place. Gratitude, embarrassment, or maybe just exhaustion. She gave a small nod but said nothing else. Leila didn't press. Instead, she offered one last reassuring smile before moving on. She had barely taken a few steps before she felt a sharp tap on her arm. Langford. The touch was just forceful enough to be unnerving, and when Leila turned to face him, his expression was cold. Next time you pass by, make sure you're not ignoring me, he said flatly. Leila paused, keeping her composure. I wasn't ignoring you, sir. I was assisting another passenger. He scoffed. Assisting. Sure you were. Heat crept up Leila's neck, but she kept her voice steady. What can I do for you, sir? Langford leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidential matter. I need a private conversation with one of your senior staff. Where is the purser on this flight? Someone who can actually handle a complaint properly. Leila studied him carefully. Our purser is currently assisting in the business class cabin, she replied. I can relay any concerns you have. No, he snapped. I need the purser. Now. Leila didn't flinch. Of course, sir, I'll inform her. Inside, she was already bracing herself. What new complaint was he preparing to unleash? She made her way to the galley and found the purser, Rachel Lynn, a seasoned flight attendant known for her unshakable calm. Rachel was in the middle of handling a minor passenger issue, so Leila waited patiently before quietly explaining the situation. Rachel sighed, nodding knowingly. All right, let's go see what Mr. Langford wants. Together, they returned to first class. The moment Langford spotted Rachel, he launched into a tirade. He ranted about the meal service, about the overhead bin incident in economy, which had nothing to do with him, and about Leila's so-called incompetence. Rachel listened with composed patience, her posture unwavering. I understand your frustration, sir, she said evenly. I apologize for any inconvenience, but our meal selections are determined before departure. Unfortunately, we can't produce options that aren't on the manifest." Langford let out an exasperated huff. "This is first class. I expect first-class accommodations." Rachel remained unbothered. "Of course, sir. If you'd like, I can offer you one of the other available entrees." "You're missing the point," Langford snapped. Then he jabbed a finger in Leila's direction. "She's the reason my flight experience has been horrendous. She's incompetent, she takes forever to respond, and she doesn't show respect." Leila's heart pounded, but outwardly she remained calm. Rachel, sensing the rising tension, smoothly redirected the conversation. "Sir, if you have concerns about service, I can make a note of them. We do take passenger feedback seriously." But Langford wasn't done. He leaned forward, voice dripping with contempt. "I've encountered her type before. They act polite, but underneath you can feel the attitude, the insolence. I want her written up, or better yet, replaced for the rest of this flight." Rachel's shoulders stiffened slightly, but her voice remained professional. "Sir, we have protocols in place for addressing passenger concerns. However, I assure you, Miss Carter has provided service in line with our airline's highest standards." Langford scoffed. "That's laughable." Leila stood there, forcing herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral. But inside she was burning. This wasn't just about a meal. This wasn't even just about her. It was about power, about control, about the way men like Langford saw the world, how they categorized people, how they dismissed those they deemed unworthy. Leila knew she was skilled, she knew she was professional, she knew she had done nothing wrong, and yet, in that moment, none of it mattered to him, because to Langford, she was just another nameless flight attendant, and that meant, in his eyes, she was nothing at all. Rachel, the purser, remained composed. "Sir, we have established protocols for handling passenger concerns. If you believe the service has been unsatisfactory, I'll record your complaint and forward it to management." Richard Langford leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms, a smug expression settling over his features. He looked satisfied, as if he had accomplished his goal of making his displeasure known. Rachel turned to Leila and gave a subtle nod, signaling for her to follow back to the galley. Once they were alone, Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Leila's shoulder. "Don't let him get to you. He's clearly looking for a fight." Leila swallowed the knot in her throat and nodded. "I'm okay," she said softly. "I just don't want this to escalate further." Rachel shook her head. "He has no grounds to take it further. Your service is excellent. We all see that. This isn't about you, it's about him." Leila exhaled slowly, relief washing over her at Rachel's affirmation. And yet, a flicker of doubt remained. She had seen situations like this before, where high-profile passengers, especially VIP clients, received far too much deference from management. Still, she reminded herself that no man, no matter how powerful, could erase the work she had put into her career with a single complaint. For the remainder of the flight, Leila focused on her duties, avoiding direct confrontation with Langford whenever possible. She continued checking on other passengers, responding to calls, and maintaining her poised demeanor. But she noticed him watching her. More than once, she caught him glaring. Other times, she overheard him whispering to Olivia. "Make a note of her name," he muttered under his breath. "I want to file a formal complaint." Leila refused to let it shake her. She had worked too hard to be here. Then, without warning, a sharp jolt rocked the plane. The overhead lights flickered as turbulence rattled the cabin. The seatbelt sign illuminated, and the entire crew swiftly suspended service, securing themselves in their designated seats. Leila strapped into her jump seat, feeling the aircraft shudder under the pressure of shifting air currents. A few startled gasps rippled through the cabin. Even Langford, so composed and self-important just minutes earlier, clutched the armrests, his knuckles white. A small flicker of karmic satisfaction passed through Leila, though she quickly silenced the thought. Still, the moment was a reminder, a stark one, that no matter how much wealth or influence a person had, nature didn't care. At 30,000 feet, no one was in control. After several tense minutes, the turbulence subsided and passengers gradually relaxed. Leila unbuckled and moved through the aisles, offering reassurance, checking for spills, and passing out fresh napkins. In first class, Langford refused to meet her gaze. his usual arrogance subdued. Olivia, on the other hand, gave Leila a small nod of gratitude when she handed her a napkin to wipe away the water that had spilled from her glass. Then, Leila noticed something odd. Langford had gone quiet. His demeanor had shifted, not in an obvious way, but enough for her to see that something was different. As she passed by, she overheard him speaking in hushed, clipped tones. "Just stall them until I land. I can't do anything from here." A pause. "I don't know what you expect me to do. Conjure a miracle night air?" Leila didn't stop walking, but her mind processed his words. So this was it. His board was closing in on him. She hadn't expected him to show humility, but it was fascinating how fleeting power could be. A man who commanded entire boardrooms was now strapped into a seat, helpless to stop the forces working against him. Time moved forward. The crew began preparing the cabin for landing. Leila made the pre-arrival announcements, reminding passengers to secure their belongings and return their seats to the upright position. Langford finished another heated phone call just as the wheels touched down smoothly in San Francisco. As passengers gathered their things, Leila stood at the exit, offering her standard farewell with a composed smile. She caught a glimpse of relief in Olivia's eyes as she gathered her bag. The woman hesitated for just a moment before giving Leila a small, apologetic smile, as if to silently say, "I'm sorry for what you had to deal with." Leila returned the nod, understanding. Langford, however, walked past her as though she were invisible. Leila exhaled and closed her eyes momentarily. It was over. And yet, something in her gut told her she hadn't seen the last of him. She forced herself to shake it off. She had another flight to prepare for, other passengers to serve. Later, after finishing her final duties, Leila stepped into the terminal to grab a quick sandwich before her next flight. As she scanned the cafe menu, she noticed a familiar face standing near a pillar. Olivia, now out of uniform, seemingly waiting for someone. Leila hesitated for only a second before approaching with a friendly smile. Olivia looked surprised, but not unwelcome. "You off to your next flight?" Olivia asked softly. Leila nodded. "Yeah, a short hop up to Seattle." Olivia hesitated. Then, after a deep breath, she said, "Look, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about Mr. Langford." Leila tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Olivia sighed. "He's under extreme pressure right now, which doesn't excuse anything, but I feel bad." Leila studied her for a moment before offering a small, reassuring smile. "I appreciate that, but it's not your fault." A visible wave of relief passed through Olivia's posture. "I know how humiliating it must have felt. I see how he treats people, and it's awful." Leila's heart softened. "We all have tough days at work," she replied carefully, not wanting to overstep. "I just hope you're okay." Olivia looked away briefly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I manage, for now." Leila wished she had better words to offer. But in moments like this, sometimes silence spoke louder than anything. Instead, she simply gave Olivia a gentle nod. "I have to go," Leila said, glancing at her watch. "But thank you for stopping to talk." Olivia returned the nod. "Thanks for listening." Then, with a quiet weight to her voice, she added, "I have a feeling we'll cross paths again." Leila felt an odd sense of knowing at those words, and deep down, she suspected Olivia was right. Leila offered Olivia a reassuring smile. "I appreciate that," she said. "But it's not your fault," Olivia exhaled, the relief visible in her posture. "I know how humiliating that must have been. I see how he treats people sometimes, and it's awful." Leila studied Olivia's face, sensing that there was more she wanted to say but was holding back. "We all have tough days at work," Leila replied carefully, not wanting to push too far. "I just hope you're okay, working with him." Olivia looked away, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I manage, for now." Leila felt a wave of empathy for her. She wished she could say something that would truly help, but words felt insufficient. Instead, she settled for an encouraging nod before glancing at her watch. "I have to go soon," she said, "but thank you for stopping to talk." Olivia nodded. "Thanks for listening." Then, with a pause, she added, "I have a feeling our paths will cross again." There was something weighted in the way she said it, almost as if she knew for certain that fate wasn't done intertwining their lives. In the weeks that followed, Leila filed the incident with Richard Langford away as just another unpleasant passenger story. She had plenty of those. She moved on, immersing herself in the parts of the job that she did love, offering exceptional service to travelers who actually appreciated it. And yet the memory of Langford's sneer, the disdain in his voice, lingered at the back of her mind like a bruise that hadn't fully healed. Then one afternoon, during a break between flights, Leila found herself scrolling through business news, an old habit from her finance studies. Her breath caught as she saw the headline, CEO Richard Langford under fire, Board of Directors demands immediate resignation. Her pulse quickened as she clicked on the article. Allegations of a toxic workplace, potential misuse of company funds, a scandal unraveling, threatening to lead to formal investigations. And then, the part that truly made her heart skip. A mention of a partnership between Langford's company and Leila's airline, a deal that was now in jeopardy, in part due to a high-profile incident involving Langford on a recent flight. Leila's stomach twisted. Could it be her flight? Had other passengers reported what they had witnessed? Within days, her suspicions turned into certainty. She was called in for a meeting with the airline's HR department. Sitting across from her was the director, a composed woman named Evelyn Hart. Leila braced herself, uncertain what to expect. Evelyn folded her hands on the desk and spoke in a measured tone. "Richard Langford filed a complaint about you," she said. Leila swallowed, keeping her expression neutral. "But," Evelyn continued, "we've also received multiple statements from other passengers praising your professionalism. More importantly, upper management has taken an interest in the situation because our airline is in negotiations with Langford's company for a corporate travel partnership." Leila nodded slowly, processing the information. Evelyn's tone softened. "I want to be clear. You're not under investigation. If anything, the airline is more concerned about Langford's behavior than yours." A wave of relief washed over Leila, but she could still sense something deeper. There were layers to this. Something was brewing. Not long after, Leila received an unexpected request. She was invited to a private meeting at the airline's corporate headquarters to discuss leadership insights. Bemused, she packed her uniform into a garment bag and made her way to the towering glass office building, a stark contrast to the bustling airport terminals she was used to. A sleek conference room awaited her, its massive windows overlooking the runway. Seated around the table were several high-ranking executives, including the airline's chief operating officer, Victoria Hahn, and a few other faces Leila had only ever seen in corporate newsletters. She straightened her posture, keeping her expression polite but composed. She recalled the advice of a mentor long ago. "In rooms like this, listen carefully. Speak only when you're certain of your words." Victoria gestured for Leila to take a seat. "Thanks for coming on short notice," she began. "We've been reviewing the situation with Mr. Langford. As you know, he filed a complaint against you, but we've also received multiple witness statements that contradict his version of events." Leila met Victoria's gaze, her heart pounding, though she remained steady. "I appreciate the opportunity to clarify," she said. Another executive, an older gentleman named Bernard Wallace, cleared his throat. "We have reason to believe Langford will be removed from his role soon," he said. "But his company remains a potential partner for us, if new leadership takes over." Leila sat still, absorbing the weight of what they were telling her. Richard Langford's fall was imminent. But that wasn't what struck her the most. What struck her was the realization that her name had become part of the conversation. The flight, the incident, had been noticed at the highest levels. And for the first time, Leila began to wonder, had she not just survived Langford's arrogance that day? Had she, unknowingly, helped bring him down? Leila sat upright in the sleek corporate conference room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across from her, executives scrutinized her with polite interest. Bernard Wallace, the older gentleman who had spoken earlier, leaned forward slightly. "We'd like to hear your first-hand account of the flight," he said. "Specifically, any remarks Mr. Langford made about the airline or its staff." His voice carried a note of caution, and Leila understood exactly what was happening. They were piecing together just how damaging Langford's words could be, not only to the airline's reputation, but to the delicate negotiations with his company. She recounted the events carefully, her voice measured. She spoke of his refusal to acknowledge her at boarding, his demand for a private meeting with the purser, and the way he had dismissed her with open disdain. She made sure to convey the facts without exaggeration, emphasizing that, despite his rudeness, she had responded with professionalism. Then she mentioned the part that had lingered in her mind the most. "I also overheard him on a phone call," she said. "He was upset about an internal investigation and said, and I quote, 'I'm not worried about any flight attendant's testimony. People like her know their place.'" A flicker of dismay crossed Victoria Hand's face, the airline's chief operating officer. And that was when Leila realized no one in this room was surprised. They had heard similar things about Langford before. When she finished, Victoria nodded. "Thank you for your candor, Leila. Unfortunately, Langford's behavior extends beyond your flight, but your account confirms details we've been tracking for some time now." Leila exhaled slowly. "I appreciate the reassurance, Ms. Han." As she left the meeting, a storm of emotions swirled inside her. On one hand, she was relieved. Her job was secure. On the other, she was unsettled by the realization that Langford's arrogance, his prejudice, had been allowed to fester unchecked for years. And now the corporate world was dealing with him, not through justice, but through its own quiet, calculated methods. Days turned into weeks. Leila returned to her flights, stowing luggage in overhead bins, navigating busy terminals, and greeting passengers with her unwavering warmth. Occasionally, she'd hear whispers from Mira or other crew members about Langford. The board was meeting, lawyers were getting involved, and there were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that Langford might attempt one last power move before he was forced out. Leila tried to stay detached. Men like Langford didn't change. They simply found new places to land, cushioned by wealth and connections. Then, out of nowhere, Leila received a corporate email. The airline was launching a leadership development initiative, and her name had surfaced as a potential candidate. At first, she was stunned. Flight attendants were rarely chosen for these types of programs, at least, not unless they already had management experience. But Leila had something few in the company knew about: her background in business and finance. She had spent years keeping that part of her life quiet, believing that her job in the skies was meaningful enough on its own. Yet, deep down, something in her heart nudged her forward. Could this be a new path? Leila submitted her application, listing her degrees, qualifications, and references. It felt surreal, like she was stepping toward a version of herself she had once imagined but never fully pursued. Weeks later, she was accepted. And just like that, her world began to shift. The program required her to split time between her in-flight duties and corporate headquarters, where she worked alongside executives to understand the complexities of airline operations. At first, it was overwhelming. She was suddenly sitting in meetings about financial strategy, negotiating partnerships, and analyzing corporate growth models, discussions she once only read about in business journals. But she adapted, and as she did, she found herself witnessing firsthand just how much power a single executive could hold over an entire workforce. She had always known that men like Langford made decisions that shaped the fate of thousands. But seeing it unfold in real time, understanding how fear and politics dictated outcomes, ignited something inside her. She wanted to be a different kind of leader, one who would never treat people like pawns. As the program neared its final phase, Leila was assigned to a special project team evaluating airline partnerships. And as fate would have it, Langford's company, Attendant, was on the list of potential expansions. A strange tension filled the air whenever his name came up in meetings. Many executives believed that once Langford was gone, Attendant's value would skyrocket and that a partnership could be extremely profitable. Leila was one of the team members tasked with analyzing the risks and benefits of finalizing a contract with the company. It was ironic, almost poetic. Not long ago, Richard Langford had dismissed her as nothing more than a flight attendant. Now her insight, her direct experience with his behavior, was shaping a multi-million-dollar decision about his company's future. And for the first time, Leila realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what kind of leader she would become. Leila's pulse quickened as she read through the documents in front of her. There it was, undeniable in black and white. Attendant was on the brink of a leadership transformation. The board was preparing to remove Richard Langford, though official confirmation had yet to be announced. And the airline's decision to finalize a corporate partnership with Titan Tech hinged on the trust that a new CEO would take over, one who wouldn't sabotage the deal with arrogance and hostility. Leila felt an odd sense of destiny settling over her. She had been belittled by this man, dismissed as nothing more than a flight attendant. And now she had a direct role in evaluating the future of his company. But this wasn't about revenge. The temptation was there, sure, but she recognized the bigger picture. This was about making the right decision for the airline, its employees, and the passengers she served every day. She wanted to stand for integrity and respect, things Richard Langford had never valued. A week later, Leila was working a cross-country flight from Chicago to Seattle, assisting in first class. She moved through the cabin with her usual ease, greeting passengers, helping with luggage, ensuring a smooth boarding process. Then she saw him. Richard Langford. Her stomach clenched at the sight of him stepping onto yet another flight. This time he wasn't accompanied by Olivia. A new assistant followed behind him, young, tense, and already looking overwhelmed. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Langford actually looked startled to see her. Then, just as quickly, his expression hardened, as if he resented being reminded of their last encounter. He settled into seat 1A, the prime first-class position, undoubtedly chosen for maximum legroom. Leila realized she would have to interact with him. There was no avoiding it. She greeted him neutrally, careful not to let any emotion slip through. He gave her a short, clipped nod, which, coming from him, was almost polite. She studied him briefly as she moved through the cabin. There were deep lines of exhaustion on his face now. Perhaps the battle with his board was wearing him down. Later, as Leila began beverage service, she stopped at Langford's seat. "You again," he murmured, not quite as sharp as before. "Is it your mission to follow me around?" Leila set his glass down gently. "I'm assigned to this route today, sir," she replied evenly. "Would you like something else to drink?" Langford narrowed his eyes, but his usual condescension wasn't fully there. He exhaled. "No," he said finally. "This is fine." He took a sip, then turned back to his phone. Leila walked away, her nerves buzzing. She silently hoped this flight would pass without another confrontation. Little did she know that hope was about to be shattered. Mid-flight, she noticed Langford growing restless. His phone was in his hands constantly, his fingers moving furiously over the screen. At one point, he muttered under his breath, frustration radiating from him. Then, suddenly, he rose from his seat despite the seatbelt sign still being on, and stalked toward the lavatory. Leila stepped forward calmly. "Sir, I have to ask you to remain seated until the sign is turned off." Langford brushed her off with a look, one that said he believed rules didn't apply to him. He went anyway. Leila let out a slow breath, deciding not to push further. But when he returned, his urgency had only intensified. He flagged her down as soon as she passed by. "I need to speak to you," he said, his voice low but firm. Leila knelt beside his seat, keeping her tone neutral. "Is everything all right, sir?" Langford ran a hand across his forehead, his frustration palpable. "I need a place to take a phone call privately," he muttered. "The lounge? Crew only, right?" Leila nodded. "Yes, sir. Crew members only. I'm afraid I can't allow passengers there for safety reasons." Langford's eyes flickered with frustration, but for once he didn't argue. Instead, he sighed heavily. "I suppose I'll have to do this from my seat then." There was a pause. Then, in a rare moment of restraint, he almost reluctantly added, "Can you at least make sure no one is listening in?" Leila suppressed a sigh. "I can't guarantee that, sir, but I'll do my best to keep the area quiet." She walked away, a strange feeling stirring inside her. How different he seemed now. Still entitled, still arrogant, but cracking under pressure. Despite his efforts, Langford's phone call was anything but private. Even from a few feet away, Leila caught fragments of it. "I won't stand down. I have just as much stake as they do. The board thinks they can force my hand. Evidence? Nonsense." Then, a sentence that made Leila's stomach clench. "No, they can't base my termination on a flight attendant's testimony alone." Her testimony. Her pulse pounded as she realized it was happening. The board was convening, perhaps right at that moment, to decide his fate. And the complaints from flight attendants, including herself, were playing a role. She had suspected this for weeks, but hearing it from Langford's own mouth made it real. Toward the end of the flight, Langford looked like a man whose fortress was under siege. For the first time, Leila saw something in his posture that had never been there before. Defeat. She found herself torn. Part of her wanted to see justice served, to watch as a man who had wielded power with cruelty finally face the consequences. But another part of her, it wrestled with compassion. She knew what it felt like to be helpless. Even though Langford had spent years treating people like they were beneath him, it was clear that he wasn't untouchable after all. In the end, Leila reminded herself, it wasn't her battle to fight. Her job was to land this plane safely. And then she would step off this flight and let fate handle the rest. Landing in Seattle, Leila assumed that would be the last time she'd see Richard Langford for a while. Yet, fate had other plans. A month later, Leila's leadership development team was scheduled to meet with prospective business partners to finalize agreements. One of those partners? Titan Tech. Rumors were swirling that Langford had finally been ousted and replaced by a new CEO. Leila couldn't help but wonder, who would be leading Titan Tech now? She was about to find out. On the day of the meeting, Leila traded her flight attendant uniform for a newly tailored business suit, feeling both nervous and excited. She joined her colleagues in a towering glass conference room overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out beneath them. Then the Titan Tech team arrived. At the helm was a poised woman named Elena Marsh, who introduced herself as the interim CEO. Elena offered a firm handshake and a warm, confident smile. "It's a pleasure to be here," she said. "We're committed to building a partnership based on respect and transparency." Leila felt a quiet surge of respect for her. This was a different kind of leadership, one that actually valued people. Elena and her team took their seats across from the airline executives. Among them were David Roswell, the airline's senior vice president, and Victoria Hahn, the COO. Leila sat alongside them, listening intently. When it was her turn to introduce herself, Elena's eyes lit with recognition. "Leila Carter," she said softly. "I believe I've heard your name before." Leila tilted her head slightly, cautious. "I provided factual accounts regarding a flight," she said. "I hope they were helpful in resolving any concerns." Elena gave a measured smile. "More helpful than you know," she said. "I'm only sorry you had to endure those experiences." Leila immediately understood. Elena was referring to Langford's behavior. Leila simply nodded, and the meeting proceeded. As negotiations unfolded, Leila observed how Elena and her team presented new policies, ones that emphasized a culture of respect and collaboration. The airline's team responded positively, and it seemed likely that the partnership would move forward under this reformed leadership. Occasionally, Leila contributed her analysis of Titan Tech's financial stability, which had already started improving in Langford's absence. She also offered suggestions for how the airline and Titan Tech could create synergy, drawing from both her business background and her first-hand experience in flight operations. During a break, Elena quietly pulled Leila aside. "Langford refused to go quietly," she admitted. "He's threatening litigation, but the board is standing firm. Investors support his removal. It was necessary for the company's survival." Leila listened calmly, though her mind flickered back to the memory of Langford's scornful eyes and sharp words on that flight. It felt surreal. Not long ago, he had seen her as insignificant. Now she was standing in a place of authority, helping to finalize a deal that would shape the future of the company he once controlled. By the end of the day, an agreement in principle had been reached. The partnership would move forward without Langford. As Leila stepped out of the conference room that evening, exhaustion mingled with quiet triumph. It wasn't just about business. It was about overcoming prejudice, underestimation, and arrogance. The next morning, Leila slipped back into her flight uniform and prepared for her next assignment. Because at the end of the day, she still loved being in the air. She still loved meeting passengers, offering warmth and proving, time and time again, that dignity and professionalism were never dictated by a job title. A few weeks later, Leila was assigned an international flight from Los Angeles to London, an overnight journey filled with a mix of business travelers, families, and tourists. She was excited. She loved international routes, loved using her language skills to connect with passengers from all over the world. Mira was working the flight too, which was a bonus. As passengers boarded, Leila greeted them with her usual warm smile, seamlessly switching between Spanish, French, and Italian, surprising more than a few travelers. Mira, working the opposite aisle, joked, "You're gonna charm the entire plane before we even take off." Leila laughed. "If nothing else, maybe they'll remember me for my language skills instead of any controversies." The cabin filled, and Leila moved effortlessly through her routine, helping travelers find their seats, store carry-ons, and settle in for the journey. Once everyone was seated, she and Mira performed the safety demonstration, gracefully walking down the aisle as they pointed out exits and underscored the no-smoking policy. As the plane lifted off under a golden California sunset bound for the Atlantic, Leila allowed herself to exhale. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely at peace. Little did she know, the past wasn't quite done with her yet. Leila moved through the first-class cabin, offering drinks with her usual polished professionalism. Most passengers were settled into their routines, either working, watching movies, or drifting off into the soft lull of the aircraft. But one man caught her attention. He sat near the front, middle-aged, with a receding hairline and a slight twitch in his expression. He wore an expensive blazer, but the way he kept checking his watch, the restless energy in his posture, he was nervous. When Leila approached, he barely looked up. "Whiskey. Top shelf," he muttered. She obliged, returning with a glass of premium whiskey, which he gulped down without hesitation. Not a man who enjoys a drink, she noted, a man trying to steady himself. Maybe he was just anxious about flying. Maybe he was preoccupied with business. Either way, Leila had no reason to suspect anything deeper. Not yet. During the dinner service, she noticed him fidgeting with his phone, subtly turning it on despite the announcements prohibiting phone use. Leila leaned in politely. "Sir, please keep your phone in airplane mode." He flicked his gaze to her, irritation flashing across his face. Still, he complied. But later, as she was clearing trays, she caught him again, this time attempting to place a call, her brow furrowed. Passengers occasionally tried to get around the rules, but they usually gave up when they realized there was no cell signal at cruising altitude. This man? He was persistent. Hours passed. The cabin lights dimmed as most passengers settled into sleep. Leila moved quietly through the aisles, offering water and checking on those who were still awake. Then she saw it. The man, muttering into his phone. A Wi-Fi call. Leila wasn't one to eavesdrop, but as she passed, a single sentence froze her in place. "I'm telling you, we have to close the deal now. Langford's not out of moves yet." Her breath hitched. Then, "Yes, I know. Leila Carter was a factor in it, but she's just a flight attendant. She can't." Her own name. Leila's stomach dropped. She forced herself to keep walking, pretending she hadn't heard a thing. Her pulse pounded in her ears. What did this mean? Could Langford be orchestrating something behind the scenes? And if so, why was her name part of the conversation? She had to tell someone. Slipping into the galley, she found Mira preparing hot towels. Leila leaned in, whispering, "There's a man in first class. He just mentioned Langford. And me." Mira's eyes widened. "Langford again?" Leila nodded, her voice tight. "I don't know what this means, but I need to keep an eye on him." Mira's usual, easygoing demeanor hardened into something serious. "You got it." They decided to monitor the passenger discreetly. Leila made a point of offering him a refill on water just to gauge his reaction. As she approached, he quickly turned off his phone screen, looking startled. "I'm fine," he snapped, avoiding eye contact. Leila smiled professionally, nodded, and walked away. But inside, her mind was racing. The flight drifted into its quiet hours. Leila took a moment to sit in the jump seat, her thoughts circling. The chances of her randomly overhearing something like that? Too unlikely. Langford had already been forced out of Titan Tech. But there had been rumors that he was trying to sabotage the airline's partnership deal, either to delay it or leverage a settlement. Could this man be an ally? An accomplice? A messenger? Leila didn't know, but she knew one thing. She was involved in something bigger than she ever intended. When they landed in London, Leila kept a close eye as the passenger disembarked. He moved quickly, slipping into the flow of travelers without looking back. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She had no proof of wrongdoing, just a fragment of a conversation. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Langford wasn't done with her yet. Back in the States, Leila resumed her corporate development duties. She threw herself into finalizing the airline's partnership deal with Titan Tech, where Elena Marsh had now been officially appointed as CEO. On the surface, everything looked secure. But Leila couldn't forget that conversation on the flight. Something still felt off. So she decided to do a little digging of her own. Using her access in the leadership program, she pulled up the passenger manifest from the London flight. Her pulse quickened as she found his name. Gerald Connolly, an investor in Titan Tech, and a known Langford ally. Leila's breath caught. Her suspicions had been right. Connolly had a reason to be talking about Langford, but what she still didn't know was why he was talking about her. And that was the part that scared her. Leila kept a watchful eye over the next few days, but nothing unusual happened. Then she received an email from the airline's legal department, a request for a private meeting regarding pending negotiations and personal safety concerns. Her breath caught. She made her way to the corporate office, her heart pounding. In a quiet conference room, she was met by Harriet Dawson, a composed and meticulous legal counsel. Beside her stood Marcus Hale, a towering man from the airline's corporate security team. Their serious expressions set Leila on edge. Harriet began gently. "Leila, we've received concerning intelligence that Richard Langford may be attempting to collect information about you, specifically, anything he can use to undermine your credibility." Leila's stomach tightened. Marcus cleared his throat. "Langford has latched onto the idea that your testimony played a critical role in his removal. He's trying to cast doubt on it." Leila inhaled sharply. "Why would he target me specifically?" Harriet exchanged a glance with Marcus. "We have reason to believe he's been in contact with Gerald Connolly, the investor who was on your recent flight to London." Leila's pulse quickened. Marcus continued. "Connolly may be trying to provoke a conflict or gather information to make you look unreliable." Images of Langford's sneer, his dismissive words, his arrogant certainty filled Leila's mind. She swallowed hard. "What should I do?" Harriet gave her a reassuring look. "Stay professional. If anyone approaches you in an unusual way, report it immediately. We'll handle the rest." Then Harriet added, "We also wanted to inform you, Titan Tech's new leadership has specifically requested you to be part of the signing ceremony." Leila's eyes widened. "They did?" Harriet nodded. "Elena Marsh wants to publicly acknowledge your professionalism. She sees it as a symbol of Titan Tech's new era of accountability." A wave of emotions crashed over Leila. Pride, nervousness, even fear. She forced a small smile. "I'm honored," she said. "I just hope this doesn't make me a bigger target for Langford's vengeance." Marcus's expression was firm. "We're taking every precaution," he assured her. "Langford's influence is fading. He's desperate. But the airline is behind you." Leila nodded, exhaling slowly. The day of reckoning was coming, and she had no choice but to face it head-on. The signing ceremony. The event was held in a grand hotel ballroom, with press coverage, flashing cameras, and executives from both companies in attendance. Leila wasn't there as a flight attendant. She was there as a rising leader in the airline's corporate program, dressed in a sleek navy suit, standing alongside the airline's top executives. Then, Titan Tech's new leadership team arrived. Elena Marsh, now the official CEO, greeted Leila with genuine warmth. As the ceremony began, the cameras flashed while Elena signed the partnership agreement, followed by David Roswell for the airline. Applause erupted. Then Elena turned toward Leila. She gestured to the podium. "Leila, would you join me?" A quiver of nervous excitement ran through Leila's body, but she stepped forward. Elena spoke first. She praised Leila's courage and professionalism, highlighting how her integrity had helped bring attention to the values both companies now aim to uphold. Leila took the microphone. She spoke about the importance of treating both employees and passengers with dignity, that respect should never be tied to a title, a uniform, or a rank. She tried to keep her voice steady, but the cameras were capturing every word. Then, a commotion. Near the side of the room, security moved quickly. A disheveled figure in a wrinkled suit pushed through the crowd, eyes blazing with anger. "Richard Langford." Leila's stomach dropped. "This is a sham." Langford's voice boomed across the ballroom. The room fell into stunned silence. Langford's furious gaze locked onto Leila. "She's just a flight attendant who overstepped her bounds. She lied about my conduct." Lucinda started to step forward, but Leila gently placed a hand on her arm. She would handle this herself. Leila raised her voice, her tone calm but firm. "Mr. Langford," she said, projecting authority, "I'm sorry you feel the need to interrupt, but no one here is under your control anymore." Langford's face twisted with rage. "You think this partnership will survive without me?" he sneered. "I built Titan Tech from nothing. I know every shareholder, every politician, every judge that matters." David Roswell, the airline's senior executive, stepped in. "Mr. Langford," he said coldly, "you no longer have any legal stake in these proceedings. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Langford let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can silence me? This whole deal is fraudulent, orchestrated by her lies." Then he turned back to Leila. "A flight attendant, of all people?" Leila felt the old sting of disrespect. But she didn't let it consume her. Instead, she stepped forward, microphone in hand, and faced him directly. "I'm not just a flight attendant, Mr. Langford," she said, her voice echoing across the room. "I'm an employee of this airline. I have devoted years to ensuring passengers are treated with kindness and safety." She took a breath, then added, "I also have a business degree, and I have been part of the leadership team that finalized this deal." Langford visibly faltered. Leila's gaze never wavered. "Your attempt to shame me for my position," she said, "only exposes your own prejudice." A ripple of applause spread through the room. Some still looked shocked. Others nodded in quiet approval. Langford's face contorted with rage. "You can't get rid of me this easily." Elena turned to security. "Please escort Mr. Langford out of the building," she said. "If he resists, contact the authorities. We have a restraining order in place." Langford's eyes widened in outrage, but the guards closed in, gripping his arms firmly. He turned, giving Leila one last hateful glare before being dragged away. For a moment, stunned silence filled the ballroom. Then, a wave of relieved voices. Elena turned to Leila. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," she murmured. "Thank you for standing your ground." Leila's heart pounded. She took a steadying breath. "We all did this," she managed. "Together." Cameras were still rolling. They had captured everything. And Richard Langford? His public downfall had just been sealed. As the security guards closed in, Richard Langford's face twisted with outrage. "You can't get rid of me this easily," he bellowed, his voice laced with fury. But the guards didn't hesitate. They firmly took him by the arms, escorting him toward the exit. As he was led away, he cast one last, hateful glare at Leila. But this time, she didn't flinch. This time, she stood her ground. In the stunned silence that followed, the tension dissolved into a surge of relieved voices. Elena Marsh turned to Leila, her expression filled with gratitude. "I'm so sorry you had to face that," she said softly. "Thank you for standing strong." Leila exhaled, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. "We all did this," she managed, her voice slightly trembling. The cameras were still rolling, capturing everything. The moment Langford lost control, the moment Leila refused to be silenced, the moment justice prevailed. Leila felt the threat of tears, but she blinked them back. She would not break now. She had won. In the days that followed, footage of Langford's dramatic outbursts spread across social media. Commentators called it the final blow to his already crumbling reputation. But what stood out more than his downfall was her resilience. Leila received an overwhelming wave of support. Messages poured in from colleagues, passengers, and even strangers. Many had faced similar dismissals and prejudice in their own lives. And to them, Leila's moment on that stage meant something. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked. A few weeks later, the airline's top management convened a special ceremony. Leila was honored with an award for excellence in service and leadership. Mira was there, grinning from ear to ear, along with many other flight attendants who cheered her on. Her family sat in the audience, their eyes shining with pride. Taking the podium, Leila spoke from her heart. She spoke about how she had found her calling in aviation, about how she had faced prejudice but chosen grace, and about how she had proven, to herself and to the world, that a person's worth isn't defined by a uniform or a title. The applause that followed was deafening. A month later, Leila was assigned to a first-class flight, a short domestic route she expected to be routine. But life had changed in ways that were subtle, but powerful. She was no longer just Leila. The flight attendant. She was Leila, the woman recognized for her integrity, her leadership, and her courage. As she greeted passengers, she felt a new sense of confidence. She had nothing to prove anymore. She was already enough. At cruising altitude, she moved down the aisle, serving drinks with her usual warm demeanor. A passenger, a woman with curly hair and kind eyes, smiled at her. "I saw you on the news," she whispered excitedly. "You're Leila Carter, right? The flight attendant who stood up to that horrible CEO?" Leila felt a flush of warmth spread through her. She smiled humbly. "I was just doing my job," she said. The woman reached out and squeezed Leila's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing the world what dignity looks like. You give people like me hope." Leila inclined her head, humbled. "I'm just grateful I had the chance to make a difference," she said quietly. And as she continued down the aisle, she realized the sky wasn't a limit. It was a horizon, one that stretched endlessly before her, one that promised growth, learning, and standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it might be. Leila had always dreamed of a career in aviation, but now she was living that dream in ways she had never imagined. Even with the exhaustion of balancing in-flight duties and corporate responsibilities, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had faced a man who mocked her race and her role, a man who tried to demean her essence, and yet here she was. Or rather, here she sat on her couch, legs aching, but her spirit unbroken. As she gazed out at the city lights, reflections of the past months swirled in her mind. The passengers she had served, the crisis with Langford. The moment she confronted him on that stage, cameras flashing. The small, everyday kindnesses shared between her fellow crew members. Being a flight attendant had given her a unique vantage point on humanity, from petty squabbles over luggage space to tearful goodbyes at the gate, from heart-pounding turbulence to the sweet relief of landing safely. And in a roundabout way, it had also given her something she never expected, a voice in shaping the very company she worked for. A faint smile tugged at her lips. She had proven her worth, not just to Langford, not just to the airline, but to herself. The lingering doubt that had once whispered, a flight attendant couldn't possibly influence corporate decisions, was gone. She had lived through the tension, and she had emerged triumphant. If that wasn't reason enough to believe in herself, she didn't know what was. Outside, the city glowed softly, lulling her into a peaceful exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring another flight, another chance to meet strangers with kindness, another opportunity to represent the airline she was proud to serve. And if she ever encountered another passenger like Langford, sneering, condescending, she would simply remember the power of dignity. Because in the end, the uniform she wore was never a limitation. It was an invitation to show the world that honor, grace, and resilience could soar as high as any plane in the sky.